We need leadership that's willing to really make those hard decisions and talk with other nations and sit down and roll up our sleeves and really see how we can come about a world without nuclear arms.
That's the voice of Archbishop John C. Wester of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe and the author of the recent Pastoral Letter calling for nuclear disarmament. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Desiree, and welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, did you get any snow this weekend?
Well, I think we got very little snow here in the D.C. metropolitan area, Michelle. I'm very, very sad to say that we did not get the exciting snow that our northern friends got. But it made for a very, very pretty snowfall, very quiet weekend, very quiet in my house, but not so quiet on the foreign policy front. Lots going on. Russian troops continue to bear down on Ukraine. The United States is preparing its own military buildup in Eastern Europe. Not a good sign. But there are good signs that diplomacy is continuing. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Blinken are going to talk again this week, so we hope those talks keep going. And I think it's good news that some are starting to float a possible compromise. No one yet in the official diplomatic ranks, but more in the expert community. We're hearing more about a possible compromise, which makes sense. I mean, Russia is focusing so much on Ukraine in part because they want to get into NATO, and that's something that threatens Russia in a number of ways. But the irony, of course, is that NATO has no interest in admitting Ukraine anytime soon. So it makes one think, what are we fighting about? Russia doesn't want Ukraine in NATO, but NATO doesn't want Ukraine in NATO either. So there seems to be an obvious compromise. Let's freeze this issue of NATO membership for Ukraine for, I don't know, some period of time, a decade or so, and see how far that gets us. Anyway, hopefully that'll be something discussed in official channels, and there'll be more about Ukraine coming up later in the show, so stay tuned for that. On Iran, talks to restore the nuclear deal are entering their final stage, so say diplomats in Vienna, and negotiations have taken a pause so that negotiators can go back to their capitals and get instructions. Progress is being made, slow progress, towards a U.S. Imposed deadline of the middle of February. And at the same time, people should keep in mind that this February deadline is useful for political reasons, to bring some sort of pressure to wrap up the talks. But we shouldn't mistake it for a true end of the road, right? If we don't get a deal in February, there's still time for diplomacy, because even once Iran reaches its breakout moment, which means it has enough fissile material for one bomb, it could still take up to 2 years to make that bomb into a workable device for Iran. So people shouldn't equate this breakout moment to Iran having a bomb. There's still time for diplomacy, and that is still our best option.
And here at Plowshares, we also have a mid-February deadline on a much lighter note. February 15th is the deadline to submit ideas for our request for proposals. If you've listened to the show, you know that it's a $1 million request for proposals that Plowshares has launched as a part of its new initiative, Equity Rises, to bring more diversity, inclusion, and equity and accessibility into the nuclear space. So go to our website, www.plowshares.org, to learn more, and we cannot wait to see your ideas. In terms of early warning, today I sit down with Katrina Heuvel, who is the editorial director and publisher for The Nation. And as Tom was mentioning, it is all about Ukraine. That is what is on everybody's mind right now. So we discuss these elevated tensions and what we hope to see next.
And then I sit down with Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe to discuss his recent pastoral letter calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the church's support for the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think this is the first time we've had a Catholic archbishop on the show. Very exciting. So it's a great conversation, and please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Katrina vanden Heuvel, who is the editorial director and publisher of The Nation and is involved with the American Committee on U.S.-Russia Accord. Katrina, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle.
As you know, the threat of a new Russian invasion of Ukraine appears to be growing. While Russia denies that it is planning to invade, it has amassed an estimated 100,000 troops along the Ukrainian border. Despite multiple meetings between Russian and U.S. delegations and exchange of communications, so far we have not seen much public progress in terms of diplomacy. What do you hope to see in terms of next steps?
No, this is as dangerous a situation as the Cuban Missile Crisis was, or perhaps more dangerous than the crisis in 1962. We are facing possible actual war with Russia. This demands, in my mind, a political and diplomatic resolution. It seems distant, far away, but there is a program, a plan called the Minsk Diplomacy Path, which was under the radar. But about 10 days ago, Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France met in Paris for 8 hours of marathon talks. Talking diplomacy restraint is valuable. The next meeting is in Berlin at first part of February. And I think it's an important process because it was in 2015 the pathway and was supported by the United Nations and other institutions. So I think that needs to be kind of processed. In addition, and this isn't glib, I just don't see war unless it's a tripwire of accidental proportions being waged the week of the Olympics. Putin is going, Xi will be there, obviously, and they will meet and talk. So I think there's time here, but it's precious time, it's dangerous time, even more than the troops, Michelle. I think the sending of weapons, additional weapons, and the sending of trainers and advisors, that is a tripwire that could be accidentally instigated. And that, to me, is one of the grave dangers.
The U.S. and some of its allies have said that if Russia were to invade Ukraine, they would face crushing economic sanctions. Do you think that economic sanctions would act as a deterrent?
I don't. I think the sanctions already have been given high priority, and almost every sanction possible has been put through. Obviously, there is the moving Russia out of the international transfer system, the SWIFT system. There's the shutting down of Nord Stream, the pipeline, but that's more a German-Russian decision, and that won't be approved until July, so that may be put off. But I just think any real sanctions, Michelle, will also impact European allies and our country in ways that are such that won't be used. I think at the heart of this, and this should be interesting to Plowshares, that it's NATO expansion. It's going back to 1990 when Gorbachev, then Soviet leader, was promised that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward due to German reunification. And even more relevant, 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia were given a fast track to NATO membership. It's a little bit of a myth right now that Ukraine could join NATO because you need to have a territorial integrity that will not be resolved until Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, is kind of, what happens to it? Will it be autonomous? Will it be within a federation? Language protections. There are all kinds of issues that need to be resolved before NATO, according to its very own charter, could bring in Ukraine. So in this time, it seems to me this idea of, I don't like the word neutrality, I want to say non-aligned, that it's a bridge between East and West, that it is whole and free and independent. Perhaps there's, I think if there's a will, there's a way, and there's some very creative diplomats. There's lack of trust but verify was one of Gorbachev and Reagan's famous phrases. But I do think perhaps a moratorium on NATO expansion, 10 years. I mean, just kind of bring in some stability in these times, because there's a kind of mythic quality to the fight for NATO expansion. And I will add one last thing. Over the last few years, it has been underreported or not paid attention to. NATO has moved eastward. So it's gone from not 1 inch eastward to up to Russia's borders. And I think that's important. And I think Putin has instigated to a large extent with all these troops, what situation we're in now. But the NATO piece is finally on the agenda in a way that people are discussing. And that could be of value, especially if one believes there could be an alternative security architecture in Europe that wasn't as militarized. There was on offer. OSCE, EU, Common European Home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So the militarization of our politics and foreign policy often leads to increase in nuclear weapons and all kinds of costs that in this time of existential climate crisis, pandemics, global inequality could be so better used than what we're witnessing now.
Well, with that, our time is up, but I just wanted to say thank you for your very concrete reminders of how diplomacy takes a lot of hard work, but it's an important tool that we've been neglecting, and there's still a role for it here.
I really do believe there's a role for restraint and diplomacy and dialogue. And too often in our culture and politics, dialogue and diplomacy are stigmatized because they don't seem tough. But diplomacy can resolve tough situations, sometimes better than weapons.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
In January, the Archbishop of Santa Fe issued a pastoral letter calling for nuclear abolition and supporting the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In the letter, Archbishop John Wester calls for a serious conversation in New Mexico and across the nation about universal, verifiable nuclear disarmament. And he writes that we need nuclear arms control, not an escalating nuclear arms race. As our listeners may know, New Mexico plays a key role in nuclear weapons production. The state is home to the Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories and the Kirkland Air Force Base, which is the largest repository of nuclear weapons in the United States. I don't think we've ever had an archbishop on the show before, so it's a great honor to welcome John Wester, the Archbishop of Santa Fe. Archbishop Wester, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tom. And let me tell you, I'm honored to be on your show. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's our pleasure. Now, to start off, can you tell us why you have issued this pastoral letter and why now? And also maybe give our listeners a sense of what is a pastoral letter. I mean, this letter is, 40 or 50 pages. This is not your typical letter. So give us a sense, what is a pastoral letter and why are you issuing it now?
Well, a pastoral letter for us in the Catholic Church, really it goes way back to the letters of St. Paul and St. James, St. Peter's. It's a letter that a bishop would write to the people of God, on important issues. And so it could take on a variety of themes. It could be on a spiritual topic. It could be liturgical. It could be social justice, such as my letter is. It could be on a lot of things. So that's what that is. And it carries a certain amount of weight, more than, say, just giving a talk on something. It would be analogous, although on a lesser scale, to the Pope issuing a motu proprio or an encyclical or something like that. And for me, I came to the Archdiocese of Santa Fe very happily in 2015. I was installed on June 4th, 2015. And I've always, I love it here in New Mexico in the Southwest, the land of enchantment. Its beauty and the people and the land is all very wonderful. One of the things that became apparent to me right away, though, was, and I suppose I always knew this, but you know how it came to the forefront of my mind that in truth, here in New Mexico, Trinity's test site and the Manhattan Project and World War II and developing and manufacturing of the first atomic bombs that were ever used in war, these things came to my mind that the Catholic Archdiocese of Santa Fe needs to have a place at the table, needs to speak to this issue of nuclear arms and to be part of a conversation. I felt, and my colleagues and I felt, that would be important to have a serious conversation on the threat of nuclear arms in our world, and to have a conversation that would lead to ultimate mutual verifiable disarmament throughout the world. So that was the idea of it. Many people will say to me, well, you're a pastor, you're not a scientist, you're not a politician, this. But I hasten to remind them that the church, like so many other entities and people in our country, thanks be to God, we have not only the right, the freedom, but the responsibility to speak our truth in the public square. Of course, in our country, people listen and then they make up their mind in the voting box. And so we wanted our voice to be heard as well as that of many others, such as Plowshares and many other groups that speak to this reality. I felt too that I grew up in San Francisco in a little suburb near San Francisco called Daly City, right on the ocean, Thornton Beach. I can still see it there on a nice foggy morning. They had the Nike missile sites there. And what struck me always was we knew they were there, but they were very quiet. They were very hidden. They were all subterranean. Now it's a park. You can actually go. They have their kites gliding and they jump off the cliffs there in their hang gliders. And you can actually see the silos. You actually see the steel. They've been all welded shut, but the steel doors that, and these were the precursors, I suppose, to what we have today. But they were at that time in the early 60s, the missiles were the state-of-the-art weapons. But it struck me how they're so hidden, and so too are nuclear arms today. You said in your introduction, we have the Sandia and the Los Alamos Labs, Kirtland Air Force Base, but it's all off. It's all no trespassing. It's off limits. You can't just see them, and you just wouldn't know. Landing at the Sunport, you wouldn't know that you're actually flying over thousands and thousands of nuclear armaments. So I felt it's important that, the truth has the light of day, that we speak about this. Yes, it's a very inconvenient truth. It's an uncomfortable truth. It's a challenging truth. But we mustn't hide our heads in the sand the way our warheads are hidden. But we must be able to talk about it. My main point is to begin a conversation, and I realize that it's emotionally charged, and sometimes the conversation may stumble because people are very emotional. But my hope would be for all of us to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and hopefully the conversation would lead toward eventual nuclear mutual disarmament.
Well, we certainly welcome the conversation and welcome you taking part in it. And it certainly makes sense from the Vatican's long history. I mean, the Vatican has had positions on nuclear weapons going back a long time that has progressed over time, right? I mean, previously, the Vatican supported deterrence, but more recently, Pope Francis has called for the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. And in fact, the Vatican was the first nation state to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Tell us how this shift came about.
I like the way you kind of gave a concise history there. I think for a long time, the Vatican and various popes and our own country and perhaps and others too, of course, had that whole idea of deterrence, that we have to keep these weapons for deterrence. And that's, I think, going to be a significant part of our conversation, has been and will continue to be a significant part of our conversation. That whole idea of deterrence, is it really valid or not? One angle or one aspect of the conversation is that while we have often said it's deterrence only, we know this through documents that we've seen. Our country, for example, and I'm sure others would imagine, have also planned for more than deterrence. They've also planned how else to use those weapons. It's a very neat soundbite, but I think we need to probe that and to look at, is it really deterrence? only. That's one point. Another point, and this is where I think Pope Francis has really, in my mind, ratcheted up this whole moral argument and changed the equation, and that is that he is saying that even possessing nuclear arms for deterrence or otherwise is immoral. That's a huge statement. That's a next step. I would see it beyond what Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict have said. And so Francis took it to another level. I believe that strongly that he's right, because we have the capacity to literally destroy our world. And that's, God, in our faith, we believe God created the world, and that only God has that power or that right, if you will. This is a gift that we're called to treasure, to cherish, to be good stewards, and to take care of it. The Pope wrote an encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care of our common home. And there are many things to talk about under that rubric, but one of them certainly is nuclear arms that are very, we have quite a few weapons that are on hair trigger alert, and so does Russia, that would destroy the world many times over. So I think that is, to my mind, significant what the Vatican has done. They've always been, as you said, the first nation state to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And they've given even more oomph, more force now, saying that even to have them is immoral. So to my mind, that means that we really have to take an even more serious look at these weapons and not sit back and kind of lull ourselves into false complacency and say, well, they're necessary because of deterrence. I know some people also say, well, I would hate to see what a conventional war would look like. And that's part of the deterrence argument. I think they would say that these nuclear weapons are deterrence because one nation wouldn't use it knowing the other nation has them, and deterrence, as I'm reading the argument, that they prevent us from a conventional war, which would be messy and awful as well. Well, there's no doubt that a conventional war would be, but to my mind, the argument is not, well, therefore we keep these destructive nuclear weapons, but rather we continue to work diplomatically and talk with nations to avoid any war and any conflict. One can just look at the conflict that we're seeing escalating now between Russia and Ukraine and the United States. So I think that's that's prompting Pope Francis to ratchet this up to another level. And I think, and also to look at even our traditional theories of just war, St. Augustine, the just war theory, and talking about the killing of civilians and innocent, non-combatants and all that. The nuclear power we have now completely destroys those moral arguments, it seems to me.
Now, in your letter, you write that we are robbing from the poor and needy with current plans to spend at least $1.7 trillion to modernize our nuclear weapons and keep them forever. Can you elaborate on that? And specifically, in what other ways do you think these large resources could be spent?
It's interesting. That's a good question, Tom. I remember, this is just a personal note, years ago, when fax machines were the rage, before computers and scanners and all were really at the front. I remember when we were entering one of our Desert Storm, I think it was, I got a fax encouraging me to buy stock in an ammunition company, and I thought to myself, how sad, how tragic, how obscene. But the reality is, war making and weapons making is huge, multi-trillion-dollar really business, so to speak. And so it takes lots of money to create and maintain our nuclear arsenal and other arsenals. So clearly, the money that we're spending on this it magnifies the problem. Not only are we not dealing with a huge issue here where we are threatening the very life, our lives, and the life of the planet, but we're also in the process taking away from money that could be spent on such important areas of our world. I think of here in Albuquerque, we have Catholic Health Initiatives, and they visit about 600 families a month on people who are expecting a child. So from free birth until 5 years old, they go in and help parents about dietary, nutrition, education. If they see issues with drugs or alcohol, they help to get them help. This is all done without any government money. They do this on their own. but we've also lobbied to have money spent on these kinds of things. So children, we know that if we, our tagline is you spend the money in the playpen, not on the state pen. If we can get to kids, before they are kind of sucked into that drug culture and crime and all that, we can really help them. Our families need support, particularly here in our archdiocese. We have a lot of poverty. So to be able to help families and to help them vocational training, help them with job training, to break that cycle of poverty. We know that education breaks the cycle of poverty. So money into education, into health. Our health system is, in my opinion, is really languishing under heavy weights. People are not getting the health care that they need, especially preventative health care. Our infrastructure is crumbling. We know that's been on the news a lot lately with President Biden's initiatives. I think of immigrants that do so much in our country, working in so many ways in our country, and the elderly. We have people living longer than ever now, and our elderly shouldn't just be shuttled off and forgotten, but they need to be prized and cherished, and we need to be caring for them. The list goes on and on. So I think that's a very compelling argument that not only are we not facing the reality of the danger and threat that nuclear armaments are, but we're also at the same time spending money that could be used for better uses.
Now, you specifically call out the New Mexico Congressional Delegation for supporting the nuclear weapons industry. And you note, as you just did, that New Mexico is near the bottom of all states in key socioeconomic indicators, and that the nuclear weapons industry seems to benefit only a few privileged in the state. Do you plan on pushing this message with Congress?
Yes, I do. I'm working with Ann Avalon, who is the head of our Peace and Justice office here in the Archdiocese. And we're putting together a robust commission, Peace and Justice Commission. And then we're going to meet again next week to start to look at some of the activities that we suggest in the pastoral letters, how we can begin to put those into place. So that certainly will be one of them. I think advocating with our elected leaders is very important. We like to use the term, and I frankly see you and Plowshares in the same position, as not calling ourselves lobbyists, but advocates, because we represent the truth. In our view, we as we see it, this is the truth. And so we're not there to curry favor. We're not there to, just try to be powerful. We're there to represent the truth, and I think in a special way to represent the poor and the marginalized and those on the peripheries. And so we do intend to lobby our elected officials and to say that this money is not being prudently spent for the reasons we've been talking about and many others, and also that we need to do other things for our people. As you say, there are privileged those who own ammunition companies and those who are in that area. They're doing well, but also, and I think it's important to say at this point that my letter is not against Lanel or Sandia Labs or Lawrence Livermore in California. We're not against them. We're not picking on them. Sometimes I hear that, well, you're picking on it. No, we're not. It just so happens that they make nuclear armaments or they make the parts that go into that. I think the labs are wonderful. These are science that is best trying to take science and put it to the good of humanity. And we see the labs already doing that. For example, it's my understanding that they help with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and putting together nuclear modeling to help us to understand how the virus is going to spread, et cetera. The labs do many wonderful things, and I think they are well positioned to be converted, just as we're converting, really, you can see from fossil fuels to clean energy fuels. The same thing is true here, to pivot from making deadly armaments to, for example, we're going to need very stringent, highly scientific and technical means of verifying that we do have multilateral de-escalation and getting rid of our disarmament of our nuclear arms. And so there's a lot of opportunities for our labs and for the jobs so I would say to our elected officials, let's look to that, that yes, let's get the money for these labs, but let's do it for things that are positive and good for humanity, not things that might destroy humanity.
And now, what would you say to world leaders such as President Biden, who of course is Catholic, who are seeking to increase defense spending and modernize their nuclear arsenals? What's your message for them?
My message, and I think the message of so many of us, is that we, the people, are speaking clearly that we believe that we do not want a second arms race. The reality is we're already in it. And it's a far more dangerous one than the first one during the Cold War. And that this is untenable. And that we need good leadership. We need leadership that's willing to really make those hard decisions and talk with other nations and sit down and roll up our sleeves and really see how we can come about a world without nuclear arms. I'm not naive. I know this is going to take a long time. This is not going to be done overnight, but we have to start the process in earnest. I know that we put off these ratification of these treaties because of COVID and all, but they've been really kicking the can down the road for quite some time, even before the pandemic. And so we need to get really serious about this and to agree with it. You just saw last week or a couple of weeks, the 5 nations that came together in Europe to make that very important statement. I think that's the kind of leadership that we need. And it's going to take leadership, not just kind of, pandering to the lowest common denominator and rattling sabers and all that. It takes courage, I think, to break the mold and say we don't just respond to these conflicts with might and war, but that we do it trying to come together. I think that's what Pope Francis has been urging so long, because in the meantime, the means that we've chosen in the past result in thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of deaths. And it's just not right. It's immoral. And I think God's calling us to a much higher plane, moral plane.
Last question, unfortunately, because we're running out of time, but I wanted to, if I could, kind of bring it back to you. In your letter, you discussed your visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how that had an impact. If you could explain how that trip impacted your views on nuclear weapons.
I think what really struck me was when I heard about those children that were attracted to the light of the atomic bomb detonating because it exploded above them there. We make a lot in our faith, we make a huge symbol of the light of Christ, the Paschal candle, the light of Christ. And that was so blasphemous to me. They were attracted to the light, as we all are attracted to the light and the truth. But it was a false light. It was a destructive light, a light that brought death. And I just thought of those poor children, I thought back to myself in the early 1960s, wondering if in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was going to happen. Because we picked up the vibrations of what was going around even as kids. We were in early teens. And then when I saw our own museum here in Santa Fe, the manufacturing and the Manhattan Project and all, I just thought to myself, boy, that's, this must never, ever, ever, ever happen again. And if we don't speak up, who will? If we don't do it now, then when? I don't know. It just moved me to begin this process.
Archbishop Wester, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all the best in all of your work.
Thank you, Tom, and yours too. I admire you and Plowshares very much. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco bass bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.